During this harrowing period, we were subjected to the most severe trial imaginable, the agonizing necessity of pulling back without having suffered a decisive defeat. 1,000 times over, the burning question arose among the ranks, why are we retreating? Yet it was never answered to anyone's satisfaction. Commanders found themselves besieged by inquiries from their weary soldiers, pleading for an explanation of this bewildering maneuver, which seemed inexplicably and irrevocably poised to shatter the very foundation of every soldier's existence. The triumphant success of our arms and their unshakable confidence in ultimate victory. Compounding this psychological torment was the stark reality that this colossal withdrawal, with its calculated creation of a vast, desolate void through the deliberate surrender of territory, often executed without even brushing against the enemy, harbored profound perils for discipline and morale. Endless herds of cattle streamed westward past our marching columns, their lowing mingling with the clucks and bleats of poultry and livestock being herded in countless thousands. Towering piles of valuable goods lay abandoned and unguarded by the roadside, awaiting transport that might never arrive. Then there were the civilians, trudging slowly along the railway tracks or beside the overburdened trains laden with an unending cascade of grain, kilometer after kilometer of desperate souls. Young girls in their teens with tear-streaked faces, women clutching infants to their breasts amid the chaos, and men of all ages, all driven by a singular primal thought, to flee the encroaching death from the east, embodied in the ruthless specter of Bolshevism. What army, enduring its 5th grueling year of war, could withstand a retreat of such monumental scale without sustaining grievous wounds to its spirit, or even undergoing a substantial disintegration of its psychological resilience and organizational cohesion? Dangerous as this withdrawal proved for the rear echelons and supply services, it imposed a trial of purgatorial intensity upon the frontline fighting forces. Stalin, ever the opportunist, marshaled every surviving soldier from the brutal clashes of his Ukrainian offensive, hurling them forward in a relentless pursuit, determined at any cost to exploit this unprecedented migration of millions across hundreds of kilometers to secure a decisive advantage. Occasionally, the enemy would inexplicably lag behind, allowing our movements to proceed without interference, our boots kicking up dust on empty roads under a vast, indifferent sky. But then, without warning, he would unleash everything in his arsenal to shatter our defensive screens, infiltrate our bridgeheads, and reap a cheap harvest from our retreating elements. Yet, despite the labyrinthine strategic and tactical predicaments into which this grand plan inevitably thrust us, flanking maneuvers that threatened encirclement, ambushes in fog-shrouded valleys, and relentless artillery barrages, he never once succeeded in disrupting our overarching intentions for any meaningful duration, let alone derailing them entirely. This deliberate, methodical withdrawal from the Donetsk basin to the Dnieper River stands as one of the most audacious and masterful operations in the annals of military history. Never before had a high command entrusted itself so utterly to the fortitude of its troops, with so little ability to alleviate their physical sufferings, the blistering heat by day, freezing cold by night, incessant hunger gnawing at their bellies, or assuage their gnawing psychological anxieties, such as the fear of abandonment or the dread of betrayal from above. For tactical secrecy, it could seldom disclose even the operational objectives or the precise direction of march, leaving soldiers to navigate blind through scorched earth and uncertain horizons. There was but one recourse: to repose absolute, unwavering confidence in the German soldier. And he never faltered in that trust, pressing onward even when the orders issued to him, or the distant command that decreed them, defied comprehension, shrouded in the fog of war's inscrutable logic. In the midst of this epic withdrawal, it became painfully evident that the German soldier had transcended the rote obedience drilled on the parade ground, evolving into a paragon of absolute devotion to duty, a stoic resolve forged in the crucible of endless hardship, where loyalty was not commanded, but internalized, a flame that burned brighter amid adversity. We soon witnessed firsthand the devastating toll our retreat exacted on this forsaken land, manifesting in the shattered lives of individuals caught in its wake. He had joined our company many months earlier, attaching himself to us like a loyal stray dog in one of the numerous villages we had wrested from the enemy during our eastward advances. At first, this young lad was the darling of the unit, his wide-eyed innocence a brief respite from the grim realities of combat. But the Spice, our no-nonsense first sergeant, soon assigned him to kitchen duty, where he toiled amid the clatter of pots and the sizzle of meager rations. There he remained, this young Shura Maujin from Pavla, a mere 13-year-old boy whom a conscript unit had forcibly dragged to the front lines. One of our patrols had captured him in a skirmish, but compassion for his tender age prompted his swift release. It wasn't long before he was chattering away in remarkably fluent German, acquired through eavesdropping on our conversations and mimicking our accents, and integrating seamlessly into the company's daily rhythm, as if he had always been one of us, helping with chores, sharing in the sparse meals, and even offering shy smiles that lightened the heaviest hearts. When the division surged eastward and established positions beyond Pavla, Shura began slipping away at frequent intervals to his native village, which lay just behind our lines at the time. He would return shortly thereafter, his small frame burdened with a bulging sack brimming with fresh eggs, pilfered from hidden coops or bartered from wary villagers. Far from resenting these excursions, we welcomed them eagerly, our mouths watering at the prospect of a rare treat amid the monotony of field rations. It never crossed our minds that he might abscond permanently or defect to the enemy. Shura was the epitome of dependability, both in his diligent work ethic, scrubbing utensils until they gleamed, chopping firewood with surprising vigor for his size, and even when manpower was critically short in the heat of battle, where he ferried ammunition under fire with unflinching courage. For that reason, the mood of the entire company plunged into even deeper gloom when, amid the chaos of the major withdrawal, it was suddenly discovered that Shura had vanished without a trace. "Man, oh man, can you believe it?" the mess sergeant grumbled angrily, his face flushed with betrayal as he slammed a ladle down on the makeshift table. Shura, of all people. Even the company commander, a stern veteran with a scar across his cheek from Stalingrad, appeared visibly upset, pacing restlessly. The Spice growled, "Just because we're pulling back this time, who would have thought?" He turned down the swarm of volunteers eager to search for the boy. No, Shura was enough on his own, they insisted, clinging to hope. Day blurred into night and night into day, as train after train rattled westward, their cars groaning under the weight of pilfered grain from Ukraine's fertile black soil. The countryside thrummed with the thunderous hooves of tens of thousands of cattle being driven relentlessly westward, their dust clouds choking the air. Night was transformed into an eerie day by the lurid glow of blazing towns and villages, deliberately torched after being deserted by their inhabitants, ensuring that no shelter remained for the advancing Soviets. Flames licking at wooden izbas, sparks dancing like malevolent fireflies into the starless sky. As the endless procession of peasant carts creaked past, laden with bundled possessions, crying children and weary elders, a soldier would occasionally point to one of the many boys perched atop them, exclaiming, "Look, that one looks just like our young Shura." We pressed on, reaching a swollen riverbank where farther upstream, a ceaseless torrent of farm produce, machinery, refugees, and of course, troops poured across a precarious bridge, the structure groaning under the strain. At our crossing point, a large, weathered ferry boat shuttled back and forth, its ropes straining against the current, ferrying men and material amid the spray of icy water. During the previous few days, we had withdrawn steadily, covering the allotted distances each day almost without enemy harassment, our columns snaking through abandoned fields under a relentless sun. But now, as if the Russians had abruptly awakened to our true intentions, they redoubled their efforts to overtake us and seize control of the riverbank themselves, their scouts probing our flanks with increasing audacity. Everything was primed for the crossing. The combat trains aligned in orderly rows, the first platoon already midway across on the ferry, their silhouettes bobbing against the choppy waves. Then the ferry returned once more to transport the final platoon under the protective covering fire from machine guns placed on the opposite bank. The first Russian assault groups, clad in mud-caked uniforms and wielding PPSH submachine guns, had already breached the river's edge on either side of our debarkation point, their shouts echoing across the water. The whole platoon scrambled aboard swiftly, the boat rocking as men piled in with their gear. Russian artillery thundered, but their shells overshot wildly, plunging harmlessly into the river far behind us with geysers of foam. Our own infantry guns barked in retort, their muzzles flashing in the dim light, all very much like a deadly game of gunnery practice across the wide, unforgiving expanse of the river. Suddenly, a shout erupted from the men clustered at the rail, their eyes fixed on the bank we had just relinquished to the Russians. A boy had materialized amid the Red Army troops, darting through their lines, then another, and a third. "If that isn't Shura, I don't know who is," one soldier exclaimed, his voice laced with astonishment. "If we get a direct hit, it won't matter anyway," muttered another grimly, his face pale in the fading light. A third reached for his sniper's rifle, its scope glinting coldly. "But at least we'll give him something to remember us by." He took careful aim, finger hovering on the trigger, then slowly lowered the weapon, a look of realization dawning. Over on the bank, the three boys had abruptly bolted to the water's edge, diving headlong into the river before the startled Russians could react, swimming with powerful, determined strokes toward the German ferry, their small heads bobbing amid the waves like corks in a storm. The men surged to the stern of the ferry, causing it to list dangerously, water sloshing over the sides. Two brave souls quickly untied a small rowboat tethered nearby and paddled furiously to intercept the swimmers halfway, oars slicing through the current. The ongoing barrage was momentarily forgotten. Nothing mattered but rescuing these three foolhardy young swimmers amid the hail of bullets skipping across the water. Just as our ferry ground against the far bank, having miraculously navigated unscathed through the storm of fire, our two rescuers hauled the first boy into the boat, his drenched form gasping for air. German machine guns unleashed a torrent of fire, laying down impenetrable curtain over the rowboat, which, after what felt like endless, agonizing minutes, finally reached the safety of the bank unharmed. One of the boys had been grazed by a bullet through the arm, blood mingling with river water. It was Shura. Before the medical orderly, with his kit of bandages and antiseptics, could finish wrapping the wound, Shura was already ravenously devouring his first bite of bread in days, crumbs scattering across his sodden shirt. "Please don't be angry with me or Hauptmann," he begged our company commander, his voice trembling with exhaustion and relief, using the formal address he had learned from us. "But when we started pulling back, I couldn't stand it any longer. I simply had to go home and see my mother." He explained breathlessly. The Bolsheviks had already overrun their village, either abducting or executing all the able-bodied men and women in a frenzy of reprisals. Only his two younger brothers had survived, concealed in a hidden cellar stocked with meager supplies. He had located them under the cover of night, and together they had set off immediately to rejoin us, dodging patrols and foraging for scraps. We tried all the time to find a gap in the Red Army lines we could slip through, but it was impossible, he recounted, his eyes wide with the memory of close calls, hiding in ditches as tanks rumbled past, whispering encouragements in the dark. We didn't give up, though. We slept during the day in barns or under bushes and kept trying to find a way through at night, until we spotted you just before the river. And now, he concluded his tale, collapsing in fatigue, "I found you at last, and everything's going to be all right." He attempted to say more, perhaps a plea for forgiveness, but his eyelids drooped, and he sank into a deep, dreamless sleep amid the circle of rough soldiers. The men stood in a silent ring around him, their battle-hardened faces softened by a mix of awe and paternal affection, the air thick with the scent of wet wool and gun oil. Our Spice, ever the gruff guardian, gently draped a shelter half over the slumbering boy, tucking it in with unexpected tenderness, as if covering his own son. And this is the poignant story of old Babushka, just one portrait among countless others, a vignette of an unknown, simple Ukrainian woman whose quiet dignity etched itself into my memory forever, a memory inextricably tied to the great, meandering rivers of the East. "A thousand thanks," said the ancient Babushka, bowing low over and over again, so profoundly that I feared her frail frame might topple forward and her forehead strike the dusty ground. We watched with amused fondness as she hastily gathered up the big, dented pot containing the remnants of the chicken soup we had been unable to finish, scraps of meat, vegetables softened to mush, and a savory broth infused with herbs scavenged from the roadside, and vanished through the low, creaking doorway of her humble izba, her shawl fluttering like a flag of gratitude. At midday, she returned faithfully, and thus it became a daily ritual, the old woman arriving punctually to collect our leftovers for herself and her 4 perpetually hungry grandchildren, their wide eyes peering from behind her skirts. 2 of her sons had been exiled to the frozen wastes of Siberia years ago, vanishing into the Gulag's maw without a trace. A 3rd had fallen in the ranks of the Red Army, his body likely left unburied on some distant battlefield. Her 2 daughters-in-law had been forcibly conscripted by the Bolsheviks to dig defensive trenches under the lash of overseers, leaving her alone to care for the little ones amid the ruins of war-torn villages. She was soon affectionately dubbed Babushka, little grandmother, by the entire company, her wrinkled face and kerchief becoming a familiar, comforting sight amid the mud and misery. But we were not the sole benefactors. She reciprocated in her own humble, heartfelt way. There might be an enormous rent in somebody's woolen socks, which she mended with swift, practiced stitches far more deftly than any of us could manage, despite her gnarled, arthritic fingers that bore the scars of a lifetime of labor. Or perhaps a grimy shirt or a pair of tattered trousers needed washing. She would whisk them away unbidden, scrubbing them in a nearby stream with lye soap until they were as clean as circumstances allowed. There was no need to ask her. She appeared day after day unprompted, mothering us all in her gentle, unassuming fashion, darning, cleaning, and offering words of folksy wisdom in her thick Ukrainian accent that somehow bridged the divide of languages and allegiances. Yet it was the serious, taciturn Rudolph whom she favored most, probably because, as she confided with a wistful smile, Rudolph has the same piercing blue eyes as my son Jacob, who was taken to Siberia 5 years ago, never to return. At that time, we were holding a narrow, precarious wedge of territory that we had driven deep into enemy lines like a spear thrust, only to relinquish it shortly thereafter under the overwhelming pressure of counterattacks. Waves of Soviet infantry, supported by T-34 tanks, grinding through the terrain. It went without saying that all of us, from the greenest recruit to the most seasoned veteran, were acutely aware of the dire situation and had mentally prepared for the inevitable withdrawal, steeling ourselves against the bitterness of yielding hard-won ground. In the end, it unfolded as it always did, everything in a frantic, chaotic rush, with soldiers scrambling to salvage their personal belongings amid exploding shells and the acrid smoke of burning vehicles. Just as our personnel carrier rattled out of the village, its engine straining under the load, Rudolph muttered angrily to himself, his voice barely audible over the din. "You idiot. I've left my old shirt with Babushka." Things turned exceedingly hot in the ensuing days. Fierce engagements in sun-baked fields and ambushes in dense thickets, and many a valiant man fell on that unforgiving sandy soil, their sacrifices ensuring that those back home could continue their lives in relative peace, oblivious to the horrors. The broad Russian heavens arched overhead, their gentle fields of glittering stars in cloudless nighttime skies standing sentinel over the makeshift graves in the east, a silent vigil amid the whispers of wind through the steppes. Our taciturn, brave Rudolph also found his eternal rest somewhere in that vast, unforgiving expanse of the East, awaiting the peal of bells that would one day ring in peace throughout the world. shortly after Rudolph's quiet death, felled by a sniper's bullet during a patrol. We launched a counterattack across the bare stubble of a freshly harvested sunflower field, where wilted stalks crunched underfoot and the air reeked of cordite. There, he had breathed his last, clutching his rifle. We hurled the enemy lines back, retaking our old village in a surge of adrenaline-fueled fury. The women and children lined the roadside as before, but the spark of hope in their eyes had dimmed, their smiles frozen into masks of weary resignation, haunted by the cycle of occupation and liberation. We trudged through the familiar streets, inquiring after this neighbor or that acquaintance, the air heavy with the scent of smoldering ruins. Suddenly, we found ourselves before Babushka's small, thatched house, its walls weathered by seasons and scarred by shrapnel. There was no sign of life, no smoke curling from the chimney, no children's laughter echoing from within. Old Wasker from the hut next door, his back bent with age and toil, slowly dragged himself up to the low wooden fence, his trembling hands gripping the splintered rails. "Babushka kaput," he intoned in a flat, emotionless voice, as if reciting a fact from a distant memory. "Many kaput." He pointed with quivering fingers to a tattered brown rag fluttering like a storm-torn banner from the low gable on the roof. "Goddamn hell," one soldier cried out, his voice cracking with rage. It was Rudolph's shirt, faded, patched, but unmistakably his. My story is short, just as life in Russia is often brutally abbreviated, and there is no happy ending, mirroring the inexorable tragedy of Bolshevism itself. The Red Army commissar, who had seized control of the village, spotted the brown shirt billowing on the gable, where Babushka had customarily dried our laundry amid the gentle breeze. Perhaps a petty, envious soul had begrudged the old woman the scraps of food she received from us and denounced her in a whisper to the authorities. Or maybe it was indeed the shirt that sealed her fate, a damning emblem of collaboration. "You've helped those Hitler swine," the commissar roared at the terrified old woman, his face contorted in ideological fury, spittle flying from his lips. It availed her nothing that she wept bitterly and protested that the children would surely have starved without the Germans' charity. And whoever eats must work. Didn't the great comrade Karl Marx decree that he who does not work neither shall he eat? So Babushka was executed, shot alongside all the other so-called traitors and fascists, those humble shirt washers, sock menders, and even the elderly man who had dared to chop wood for our mess kitchen. And because the 4 grandchildren had wailed and clung desperately to her skirts, refusing to let go, they were compelled to accompany their grandmother on her final, eternal journey into the cold earth. Silently, we filed into Babushka's house, the floorboards creaking under our boots, the air stale with abandonment. From the wall, we carefully removed a yellowed old photograph depicting her in her younger days, vibrant, with a spark in her eyes, perhaps from a time before the revolutions and purges had scarred her land. We sent it as a memento to Rudolph's mother, far away in the west, a small token bridging the chasm of loss. When a few weeks later we were forced to evacuate the village once more to shorten the front line, strategic maps redrawn in haste amid incoming fire, we deliberately pulled the glowing embers from the stove and scattered them into the dry straw bedding, igniting a blaze that consumed the structure. No one marching under the blood-red flag of the East would find refuge under that roof again. At the edge of the village, we paused silently for a moment, gazing back at the inferno, flames leaping hungrily skyward. Rudolph's tattered old shirt fluttered from the gables, soon engulfed by a cascading torrent of flying sparks, vanishing into ash. Then we turned and marched onward to fortify our new defensive line, steeling ourselves for the inevitable enemy onslaught. Later that day, I overheard a Sturmbannführer remark casually, his tone dripping with disdain, "No need to waste any pity on that scum." He must have discerned the revulsion etched on my face, for he added challengingly, "Maybe you don't agree?" My throat felt parched, constricted by a surge of emotion, but I managed to reply quietly, my voice steady despite the inner turmoil. "Sturmbannführer, I don't." He stared at me in astonishment, then turned away, muttering something derisive to his adjutant about German sentimentality and its weaknesses in wartime. The rest of the men, sensing the tension, crowded around me in solidarity, shaking my hand in silence, their grips firm and reassuring, a quiet affirmation that not all had succumbed to the dehumanizing grind of the front. Around that time, I began to observe a profound shift permeating the company's demeanor. Both officers and enlisted men in the fighting units were starting to scrutinize events more critically, drawing conclusions that mirrored my own growing disillusionment, the futility of certain strategies, the moral quagmires we navigated. It was only in the lofty echelons where decisive orders originated that blindness and deafness seemed absolute, impervious to the realities on the ground. However, the ferocity of the combat and the staggering enemy superiority in numbers and material left scant time for discourse, let alone introspection. Over and over, we charged into the fray, repelling the enemy hordes with bayonets fixed and grenades at the ready, only to be compelled to yield ground again to evade encirclement, our losses mounting like a grim tally. Our casualties were grievous, for no amount of spilled blood could compensate for the absent east wall, with its promised concrete pillboxes, deeply echelon trench systems reinforced with barbed wire and minefields, and impregnable strongpoints manned by fresh reserves. What tremendous tales, both official propaganda broadcasts and whispered unofficial rumors, had been spun about that mythical fortification. And though it wouldn't have shocked us to discover discrepancies between hype and reality, to encounter absolutely nothing whatsoever, but this fantastical fabrication was too much to bear, a betrayal that gnawed at our souls. For the first time, a chilling fear gripped me, a sensation of utter abandonment, as if I, and the entire German army in the East, were forsaken warriors battling a hopeless cause, adrift in a sea of deception. Before us loomed a pitiless, treacherous enemy, swift to capitalize on every vulnerability. Ambushes from concealed positions, feints that drew us into kill zones, and psychological warfare via leaflets promising mercy. Behind us stretched a command structure oblivious to the foe's true essence, squandering every opportunity on rigid paper doctrines and antiquated ideologies that bore no relation to the fluid, brutal warfare of the steppes. I confronted the gravest decision of my life amid this maelstrom. We had been bombarded with the appeals of Seydlitz and his ilk, showered upon us in millions of fluttering leaflets like a perverse snowfall, the specter of Torgau prowling for more disillusioned souls to ensnare. The abrupt emergence of this National Committee of Free Germany and the League of German Officers struck us in the East, prisoners and frontline troops alike, like thunder from a clear, azure sky. Erich Weinert, the German communist leader and propagandist, alongside Walter von Seydlitz, heir to a storied Prussian general's legacy, had lent their names to this orchestrated intellectual revolt brewing behind the barbed wire confines of Russian and Siberian POW camps. Then, later, a new name echoed faintly at first, but swelling with ominous force, a name that, to the German people, epitomized the tragic fate of hundreds of thousands of our Stalingrad soldiers, General Field Marshal Friedrich von Paulus. There is no denying that this revolt was masterfully orchestrated, conceived in the shadowy depths of the Politburo with the cunning and seasoned expertise of the Kremlin's veteran commissars. Its pillars rested on two tenets from Bismarck's political testament: never expose Germany to the peril of a two-front war, and uphold the traditional Prussian-Russian alliance, all glossed with the historical gloss of Russia's infamous breach of faith at Torgau. Among the millions of German prisoners languishing in captivity, the reaction was surprisingly tepid, particularly among the non-commissioned officers and enlisted men. Beyond a thin veneer of political opportunists and turncoats, it garnered few genuine adherents, mostly impressionable German romantics, who drew inspiration less from the tragic, forsaken figure of the Stalingrad Marshal than from the legendary uprising of General Ludwig Yorck and his officers. Among the German soldiers enduring on the Eastern Front, the response was outright repudiation and profound contempt, a visceral rejection of what they perceived as treasonous folly. Nevertheless, the constellation of illustrious names among the officer rebels exploded like a thunderbolt upon the astounded ears of German soldiers and prisoners in the East. There was Seydlitz, of course, and General Lieutenant Edler von Daniels, Oberst von Hoensbroech, Steedel, General Major Korfs, Latman, Major von Frankenberg and Pritzwald, Major von Nobelsdorf, Brinkenhoff, Oberleutnant Gerlach. And since the Soviet strategists naively presumed that contemporary Germany required an unknown corporal for authenticity, there was plain old Grimmendorf, bravely arrayed alongside all that eminent nobility. But the name that truly rattled the Eastern Front soldier to his core was that of Friedrich Paulus, this relatively young general, once Rundstedt's chief of staff, personally elevated by Hitler over more senior peers to succeed him, who had once been the most reviled of all German generals by the Russians. It hadn't been long since Ilya Ehrenburg, Stalin's personal journalist-in-waiting, had branded Paulus the butcher of Kharkov for his ruthless suppression of an incipient revolt in that beleaguered city. His stunning volte-face remained an enigma, yet even his example failed to erode the morale of the German Eastern Front soldier. Lurking behind it all were the smirking visages of Stalin and Kaganovich, their ultimate aim the Bolshevization of Europe. It was all too transparent, a machination laid bare. Even if our path had veered astray, could we consign our homeland, countless women, children, and innocents, to that existential threat? Though we marched inexorably toward our doom, could we ignore the solemn call to duty and loyalty emanating from the desecrated graves of our comrades, plowed under and obliterated by Bolshevik tanks? Though they were, I resolved to persist on this path, to see it through to its bitter conclusion, with eyes wide open and exerting every ounce of my influence to mitigate the folly. Perhaps a higher power would mercifully spare me the full brunt of defeat, reuniting me with my silenced comrades in eternal repose. I made this decision knowing not only that our road was erroneous, but that our guide was flawed. Yet were we not ensnared in a web far more insidious and all-encompassing than any Soviet divisions could weave? The net of our own dawning realization. How indeed could one individual comprehend everything, perceive everything, feel everything, and act upon everything? This deification endures only until something mightier emerges. Then, the absence of a genuine communal bond reveals its fragility, as all hinges on the singular figure expected to perform miracles, despite being merely human, burdened with human virtues and frailties. Simply a man. One man may indeed make audacious decisions, galvanizing an entire nation in his wake, but that same man may falter grievously, dragging the populace into abyss. The communal path, though halting and uneven, is more deliberate, whether ascending or descending. The eyes of many observe more than those of one. The ears of many discern more than those of one. No, never again totalitarianism. That I vowed solemnly. If only we could avert this mortal peril, hurl back Bolshevism with all our might, then we would unite in a revolution of reason, a reclamation of sanity amid the madness. The sacrifices exacted at the altar of the Führerprinzip were too immense, and back then I still had no inkling of their true, staggering magnitude. It was precisely during this agony of doubt and indecision that the incident with the dying deserter unfolded, a stark illumination of the enemy's psyche. We had witnessed Russian regiments mowed down before our machine guns hundreds of times, their bodies piling in grotesque heaps amid the churned mud. Hundreds of times we had grappled with the enigma of this Eastern War. How could a people so tortured and oppressed, beyond any other in the world, exhibit such willingness to perish for their oppressors? Of course, we did not encounter in the Red Army man the same conscious devotion to duty or profound grasp of ultimate truths that animated our own troops, honed through discipline and camaraderie. But that utter disregard for their own lives, that merciless ruthlessness toward enemy and self alike, remained an unsolved riddle, a psychological abyss we could not fathom. If the Bolshevik experiment had triumphed in anything, it was in the mechanization of human existence, from the Stakhanovite worker, whose every rhythm of sleep, wakefulness, laughter, tears, meals, and even digestion was regimented to meet production quotas, to the Red Army soldier's robotic mode of combat, all emblematic of materialism's cold victory and the soul's obliteration. The heart was extinguished, the soul of the Russian people slain before the firing squad's muzzles, and yet the machinery ground on in its prescribed mechanical order. Though genuine enthusiasm had perished in the Red Army's ranks, the men who bore the ultimate reckoning for those whose debts remained eternally unpaid, these same soldiers fought and died like automatons, wound-up puppets propelled by forces beyond their comprehension, sacrificing for abstract problems and hollow phrases they had never truly grasped. They perished as they had lived, like machines devoid of agency. We sometimes observed that enemy defenders would unleash a hail of automatic fire until the very last instant, only to leap from their foxholes, discard their rifles, and approach us with a cheerful, almost boyish grin, requesting paparosi, cigarettes, in broken German. At other times, companies charging with the blood-curdling Jura battle cry would advance to within meters of our lines, only for the survivors to crawl through our barrage, offering their weapons and ammunition in surrender. With my own eyes, I beheld Russian prisoners, moments after capture, snatching up discarded rifles to fire upon a Soviet bomber that had targeted our position. The very same men who, mere hours before, had defended their lines with ferocious tenacity. "You think you found a friend and pour out your heart to him," the deserter whispered hoarsely, his eyes glazing with the approach of death. "And perhaps he really is your friend. It's just that he's also one of those involuntary bloodhounds who hound the masses of peasants and workers herded together. Suppose he possesses a conscience and refrains from reporting you. Then another informer, perhaps oblivious to the first, alerts the Patriotic to your prolonged conversation. Interrogations ensue, relentless and psychological, until your friend crumbles and divulges fragments of the exchange. That is the end. Next morning, you are liquidated. A distant shot echoed, perhaps an outpost skirmish, or the Patriotic's pistol delivering its final verdict. You're under the magnifying glass day and night, and whatever you do is seen and heard. And then you ask why the Red Army is so ready to die for its hangman? The net holds us all prisoner, all of us, from the greatest to the humblest, from our first steps on the Baroque square till our last tumble into the mass grave. Our shells rumbled overhead like distant thunder, and farther down the line, an anti-tank gun barked sharply, its report cutting through the night. The dying man fell silent, but before departing this wretched existence, he opened his eyes one final time, his gaze piercing with urgency. "Break it," he whispered faintly, his voice a mere thread. "Break open the net, you Germans." Over by the woods, Red Army men bellowed their final Jura in homage to their Bolshevik overlords. But the deserter heard no more, his body going limp in the flickering lamplight. We lay by our rifles, ears attuned to the fading echoes of mass dying, the wind carrying faint cries across the frozen waste. Right in the thick of this difficult, casualty-laden fighting retreat, word reached me of the death of Franz Roth, one of the most accomplished combat photographers on the German side in World War II, his lens having captured the raw essence of the front in countless haunting images. Shortly thereafter, orders arrived in the Kagan area directing me to the capital of Croatia, where a new corps was forming, the 3 SS Panzer Corps. This unit was to comprise primarily volunteers from the Germanic nations, Holland, Flanders, Denmark, and Norway, under the command of General der Waffen-SS Felix Steiner, a tactician renowned for his innovative defensive strategies. I felt a bittersweet mix of emotions at leaving the Eastern Front after nearly 3 unrelenting years. I had often envied my comrades stationed in Italy and France, who reveled in the sun-drenched pleasures of Biarritz and Capri, while we dodged death daily amid the Russian steppe's merciless expanse. Yet, for all the horrors, a touch of sadness and melancholy tugged at me. There is a peculiar, haunting allure in the boundless Russian landscape, one that repels with its desolation yet enthralls with its vastness, sickening the soul while igniting an inexplicable yearning. Even today, after years of unimaginable horror and strain, the screams of the wounded, the stench of decay, the ceaseless roar of artillery, scarcely a veteran of the Eastern Front exists who does not, at times, feel a nostalgic pull toward the endless horizons of the Russian land and the enigmatic depth of the Russian character. But my sojourn in Croatia was destined to be brief, mercifully so, for the pattern persisted. The same litany of command blunders, one misstep compounding another in a cascade of strategic folly. An order soon arrived, yanking us from the lush, fertile fields of Croatia, vineyards heavy with grapes, rivers sparkling under Mediterranean sun, and dispatching us northward to the Narva bridgehead. We detrained to Jovi, a modest Estonian town shrouded in pine forests, and proceeded by motor march to the narrow bridgehead, spanning little more than 2 kilometers wide across the deep blue waters of the Narva River, its currents swift and unforgiving. Columns of black smoke and roaring flames billowed from the opposite bank, just across from Hungerberg, the quaint Estonian seaside resort on the Gulf of Finland, where one of our heavy shells had struck a Russian fuel depot, igniting a conflagration that painted the sky in infernal hues. In front of us, within Narva itself, an eerie quiet prevailed. A lull gripped the front, the silence heavy and oppressive, pregnant with the anticipation that all hell might erupt at any instant, shattering this unnatural calm with a symphony of explosions and gunfire. Soon, we encountered roadside warnings scrawled on makeshift signs: road under enemy observation, warning, road under artillery fire. A column of wagons, drawn by small, shaggy horses with steaming flanks, plodded unconcernedly down the perilous stretch, their drivers hunched against potential peril. Then shells began to plummet on either side, earth erupting in geysers of dirt and shrapnel whistling overhead. But we emerged unscathed, hearts pounding. We transitioned to an improved road flanked by the first buildings of Narva, dilapidated structures pockmarked by bullets. God verdum, a sentry called out in accented German. That was a close one. It was a Dutchman from the Netherlands Brigade, standing guard in that sector, his uniform muddied from trench duty. Then we entered Narva proper, that enigmatic and storied city of northern Europe, contested and besieged innumerable times throughout history, yet enduring into our era as a bulwark between civilizations. Standing astride the ambitions of 2 worlds, Europe and Russia, its walls had eternally been encircled by war and devastation, from medieval sieges to modern bombardments. All that remained of its former beauty and splendor were ruins. Barrage fires and aerial bombings had reduced this pearl of the north to one of Europe's most devastated rubble heaps. Streets choked with debris, buildings reduced to skeletal frames. Yet, the magic of its past lingered in the winding lanes amid shattered houses. The old gate of the city church still defiantly displayed its 6 grim skulls and 2 fiery torches, symbols of mortality and vigilance. Cupids gazed down whimsically from the gateway of the fawn house, untouched by the chaos. The stork perched on one leg atop the tower of the city hall still surveyed the east with wary distrust, as if anticipating the next salvo. And towering over all were the twin emblems of this resilient old town, the Hermansfestung, Tall Hermann, and its younger rival, Ivangorod, monuments to the ceaseless struggle that had defined Narva's existence for centuries. Today, once again, Narva stood as the focal point of North European history. Founded in the 13th century by Germanic tribes, chiefly the Danes, as a bastion against the encroaching threat from the east, it was later seized by the Teutonic Knights and fortified into a formidable European stronghold against Russia. Its largest tower, the Long Hermann, was erected under Grand Master Hermann von Buxhovden. Opposite the fortress rises Ivangorod, massive and defiant, a testament to Russia's unyielding claim on Europe. Legend recounts that Ivan III, Grand Duke of Russia, commissioned a Greek architect for its construction, only to blind him afterward to prevent replication of such a marvel in the frozen north. Narva witnessed the triumph of the 17-year-old Swedish King Charles XII over a Russian force 4 times his size, as well as the devastating defeat inflicted on the Swedes by Peter the Great, who claimed Narva as Russian territory for centuries thereafter. Not until 1918 did German soldiers march once more into the ancient citadel, only to withdraw in the fateful November of that year, paving the way for Bolshevik occupation and a reign of terror. Then Estonian, German, and Finnish volunteers, allied with White Russian General Yudenika's regiments, repelled the Bolsheviks and advanced deep into Russian soil. Estonia's hard-won independence, grudgingly recognized by the Soviets, endured a mere 2 decades before the eastern hordes surged across the Narva again in 1940, annexing the old Estonian and German lands under spurious security pretexts. In August 1941, it fell to German soldiers to hurl the enemy back across the Narva, Northern Europe's eternal bulwark against the east, and pursue them toward Leningrad. Following numerous German withdrawals and front shortenings, Narva had reclaimed its role as the gateway between Europe and the East, just as it had been 700 years prior. In dugouts and trenches, in concrete pillboxes, and the barren wastes of no man's land, men from the Waffen-SS hailing from all Nordic countries fought shoulder to shoulder with Estonian volunteers for Europe's very survival. Thus, Narva persisted into our turbulent era as it had for ages, the key to Northern Europe, where the continent's fate would be sealed. This was the world's dividing line, but we were not alone in recognizing it. The Bolsheviks grasped it too, unleashing assault after assault to capture this heap of rubble and deliver a mortal blow to Northern Europe. Savage air raids pummeled the town and our bridgehead. Sudden barrages hammered our lines to erode defensive morale. Soviet tanks, behemoths of steel-belching exhaust, attempted to bulldoze through to the fortified riverbank. But it was futile. The men whose forebears had battled under the Teutonic Knights, who had conquered under Danish and Dutch banners, repelled the Russian masses, holding the diminutive Narva bridgehead like an unyielding breakwater amid the crimson flood, compelling the Kremlin to defer its ambitious schemes for Baltic redistribution. The Estonians, defending their homeland within the 20th Waffen Grenadier Division der SS, Estnish NR1, forged a battle cry that became the Narva Front's rallying watchword. Out of the rubble grows revenge. The Kremlin had scant prospects in that sector. Fighting for freedom alongside the Dutch and Norwegians, the Flemish and Danes, stood these descendants of Prince Eugene's military frontier, pioneers and settlers from all German regions, from the Banat and the fertile Bačka country, from Transylvania's dense forests and Romania's rugged mountains. They had journeyed to this alien northern clime, amid North Estonia's unfamiliar bogs and pines, to safeguard their families, homes, and heritage, their bloodlines and empire. And they acquitted themselves magnificently, adapting to the biting cold and relentless skirmishes with unyielding resolve. Between these southeastern warriors and their northern and western counterparts, united at Narva in defense of Europe's future, a profound camaraderie blossomed, the bond of shared peril, mutual peril, and collective combat, forged in the crucible of foxholes under starry Baltic skies. Russian shells didn't always strike true, and despite the gunners' fervent efforts, adjusting elevations amid the clamor of commands, the spire of the city hall, evocative of Amsterdam and Haarlem's architectural grace, still pierced the sky defiantly above its pockmarked roof. "It's all the same now whether they hit it or not," lamented the old washerwoman who mothered the company, her hands raw from scrubbing uniforms in icy streams. Narva is dead. The German church had suffered grievous damage, its once majestic Baroque beauty, crafted by diligent 17th century hands, reduced to rubble, with only its massive corner buttresses gleaming stark, white amid the debris. In ruins, too, lay the ancient bourse, where once the valor and tenacity of sailors, peasants, and soldiers had been alchemized into golden coinage. Of the venerable apothecary, merely the bare front wall endured, resembling a shabby theatrical backdrop riddled with holes. Here and there, amid the detritus of demolished homes, a gracious old gateway stood sentinel, its ornate carvings a poignant counterpoint to the surrounding devastation. Dates chiseled into facades from over 4 centuries ago, elaborate scripts weathered by time, spoke of the wealth and resilience of this ancient fortress town on the Narva. Quick swallows darted past us, their flight straight and swift as arrows, wheeling and ascending steeply into the sky's vault. They arrived in Narva with the tardy spring, as they had immemorially, undeterred by human folly. They had witnessed Sweden's king humble Russia's might, swooped around stonemasons erecting Buxhovden's Långherman, and soared above the blinded Greek cursing the Tsar before his masterpiece, the formidable Ivangorod. They had seen the hammer and sickle ascend and descend, German battle standards fluttering beside Estonia's blue-black-white tricolor of a valiant people. And still they returned. Neither fire's roar nor smoke's pall, neither detonating shells nor warriors' cries deterred them. Through centuries, war, sorrow, and joy cycled endlessly, but in late spring, the swallows invariably graced Narva. The iron crosses in the cemetery loomed black against the pallid luminescence of the northern night, stars twinkling through the chapel's shell-shattered roof. Golden icons lay strewn across the floor, glinting faintly. We navigated the churchyard cautiously, amid blooming flowers and blossoming trees, the narrow path cratered by explosions. Many trees felled and splintered across our way. Generations of Narva's burghers slumbered here in the old Hanseatic and Teutonic towns' hallowed ground. Germans, Swedes, Danes, Dutch, Estonians, interspersed with white Russian officers or priests. The song of the spires, Estonian kin to the European nightingale, resonated insistently, enchantingly through the gray twilight. Above, heavy shells chugged and groaned. Forward in the sap, a machine gun chattered. Again, shells moaned closer. We flung ourselves among the graves as shrapnel rained harmlessly overhead. Rising, my gaze fell upon a large cross. Jacob Nicodemus, butter merchant and seafarer of Narva, born the 21st of May. The year had been obliterated by shrapnel, but the epitaph endured. All thou canst give, O Lord, hast thou made mine. Joy and sorrow, work and strife. Give, O Lord, to those who follow the greatest in life. Joy and sorrow, work and not least strife. Hours later, returning to billets, we intended to decipher the date anew, but the cross lay shattered to fragments by a Russian shell. At the town's far end toward Krenholm, 2 wooden houses blazed like colossal torches in the morning breeze. A small group of Dutch engineers marched down the road, singing robustly. Amid the clear morning birdsong rumbled our heavy guns' distant thunder. The old washerwoman was mistaken. Narva lived on, its beauty radiating from ruins, from rubble-framed Baroque gateways, from intricately carved dates, from the landscape's haunting allure. What infused this ancient town with vitality and fortitude was its immutable spirit of defiance against the East. We were positioned perilously close to the enemy, in spots no more than 35 meters from their lines, a breath's distance, in the shell-torn no-man's-land strip. Dead silence reigned between us and the Soviet sap, broken only by occasional heavy shells rumbling across our positions. Off to the right, the rapid staccato of the Hitler saw, as Russians dubbed RMG-42, erupted sporadically. Then oppressive hush descended anew over the ghostly terrain. Rain poured in monotonous sheets from a pale gray sky, flooding trenches knee-deep, gurgling over rubber boot-tops. Undaunted, men stood scattered in the trenches, staring motionless toward the Russian line for hours, sometimes the entire day, often solitary, sometimes paired. One with field glasses scanning for movement, the other resting to conserve energy for the inevitable clash. A youth's eyes gazed hard and cool toward the enemy trench, whispering from the corner of his mouth, "Nothing out of the ordinary to report." 2 men approached, bent and stooping along the trench. They straightened momentarily as they passed, and in that instant, a sharp crack rent the sodden air like a whip snap. We ducked, who craved death in the dreary gray of a wet morning. Silence returned, deathlike, and we proceeded. But the sniper team in Narva's front line stood vigilant. gazing into the dawning day. More awaited farther along. This time, two lads from Transylvania, Rudolph, 19, with a fresh-faced earnestness, and Michael, 24, hardened by experience. We conversed about their distant homes, the misty Carpathians, family hunts in autumn forests, about the war's toll, about life's fleeting joys. Rudolph's father and brother were hunters. He inherited the instinct. Hand him a rifle, and his eyes sought prey instinctively. Michael had witnessed his first hunt as a boy. Now, they resumed the hunt, but here the quarry shot back. "We only fire occasionally, but we must hit when we do," Rudolph explained, his eyes alight with focus. "Otherwise, we reveal ourselves." A Bolshevik emerged in the opposing trench, a quick aim, crack. He slumped forward. Hit or ducked. Hours of waiting ensued, then another target. Shot fired. The man halted, tilting backward. A pencil mark on the dugout wall tallied the score. That guy won't shoot at my comrades anymore, or at me. What occupied their thoughts as they notched kills? Duels arose when foes spotted our snipers, cunning tricks deployed, magazines emptied from decoy positions, dashes back to original, stands to provoke response. Once located, it often ended the contest. Sometimes our man fell, then another replaced him, as the forward line's eyes, behind whose watchfulness others relaxed. One evening in this bitterly contested Narva bridgehead, we glimpsed the Soviet mentality's essence. In falling dusk, Dutch and ethnic German SS grenadiers manned the parapet, tensely scanning no man's land. The Russian barrage lifted, they'd assault imminently. Pale fog billowed from vegetation and woods ahead, Ivan's smoke screen masking his advance on our forward position. Nonetheless, our bullets scythed into their ranks from all flanks, artillery barraged beyond, and penetrators were repelled at bayonet point. Dozens of Red Army men perished for Stalin's world revolution. Later, a patrol reconnoitered toward the woods, drawn by flickering lights. They halted in shock at the first enemy dead, charred and burnt. Farther, fires smoldered in the gray night. One stirred. The Dutchman leaned, but he was dead. Then realization dawned. When commissars couldn't retrieve dead or wounded, they doused them in gasoline or flammables and ignited them. Forward, comrade. World revolution awaits. And when the moment comes, a bottle of gas. Burn faster, comrade, burn faster. Papa Stalin demanded not just lives, but especially deaths, erased evidence of failure. The next morning, orders summoned me to SS Brigadeführer Wagner, a newly formed division, the 14th Waffen Grenadier Division der SS, Galicisch NR 1, urgently required officers and NCOs. I was assigned, perhaps due to my known sympathies toward Eastern peoples. I was to assume platoon command immediately. The division would fight in Galicia. The sole consolation, travel via Vienna, reuniting with my wife. In Vienna, I was stunned by civilians, even relatives, ignorance of the East's realities. They prattled about wondrous new weapons, secret miracles. When I noted we'd seen none, despite desperate need, they dismissed me with incredulous gestures. It escalated to near fisticuffs with my father-in-law, a militia captain. They knew better than I or my comrades, we hapless Eastern Front representatives. My accounts of injustices and political madness met flat disbelief. Resentful, I silenced myself, as often before. Relief washed over me, heading east again. In Krakow, I first heard wild rumors, things amiss in Lemberg, Lviv. I scoffed. Wasn't Lemberg Galicia's strategic linchpin, psychologically vital for the Galician SS division? Probing yielded nothing. Cautiously, I abbreviated my Krakow stay, pressing onward. One station outside Przemysl, the historic Habsburg fortress town, the train halted abruptly. A major appeared with steel-helmeted military police horde, submachine guns shouldered. A fine martial sight, almost too martial. Combat teams forming here to seal a temporary breakthrough. Men exchanged knowing glances. So trouble in Lemberg after all. I presented my orders and pass. The major apologized but insisted no exceptions. I argued my front war destination, but futile. This major hunted every private like the devil's souls. We crammed into bare, gloomy quarters, idling hours in sleep or boredom. Furious, I stewed. Toward evening, entrained anew, we headed for Przemysl. Initially, I contemplated escape, but reconsidered, uncertain if emergency genuine or mere panic. At Przemysl, herded into spacious barracks, we sprawled on floors. Night brought air raid alarms. Orders evacuated us to outdoor trenches. Distant tracers arced from a lone battery. Weary Soviet planes droned overhead, dropping sparse bombs afar, the quintessential rear area farce. Language among ranks was colorful indeed. We returned prematurely. Morning brought no news. Our numbers swelled to 3,000. If emergency, why not deploy us? No gunfire audible. A breakthrough sans artillery? Novel. Finally, companies and platoons formed. I led a platoon. Again stasis. We lounged on parade grounds amid barracks, bored amid blaring military marches. Suddenly, icy silence gripped the garrison. Loudspeakers boomed. A great crime attempt failed. Führer unhurt. Criminal revolt crushed. Uproar ensued. Only officers silent. Wild denunciations targeted plotting officers. I said naught, too shaken. Gradually, a void formed around me. I stood isolated, realizing my Waffen-SS uniform repelled them. A vision lasting 2 to 3 minutes. Then they rushed back, chattering effusively, erasing the moment. But I never forgot. Music resumed unbroken. Then Goebel spoke. An hour later, peering through barbed wire, we were confined, even for walks. I spied a known Hauptsturmführer driving past. Desperately, I shouted. He recognized, halted, advocated to the major. 10 minutes later, freed from this bizarre combat farce, the Hauptsturmführer invited lunch, promising Lemberg transport. Lunch surprised. Sole other guests, a Russian general, Vlasov's associate, and his young wife. She interpreted fluently. The general and I conversed animatedly. His view of our political errors, resignation. You've made and continue these mistakes because, despite high-sounding phrases, you don't grasp the peril for yourselves and Europe. Bolshevism is consistent, absolute, but you merely talk, dallying between good intentions and indifference. Take Vlasov, chosen as ally against Bolshevism. He requested ragged trousers replacement in camp. Supply sergeant initially rebuffed indignantly, then relented. That epitomizes your Eastern policy. He paused. Then, do you realize 3 million Russian POWs starved in 1941's winter? Diabolical plot to annihilate subhumans? Administrative blunder? Or your infamous indifference, almost Russian? If deliberate, why not spare anti-communists, liquidate Bolsheviks? That's Bolshevism's method. Why not systematic shootings, poisonings? Instead, millions innocent on your conscience, hundreds of thousands deserving, Ukraine's sympathy lost, communist core intact. But suppose mistake, not impossible. We're the guilty. Their gallows? Punishing might rally sentiment. But no, incompetence lingered, squandering Eastern political capital to villains. Bolshevism would have starved them too, perhaps double. But stage show trials of own agents, convicted sabotage, executed solemnly. You'll never learn. That's why you're doomed. I silent, host embarrassed, lacking rebuttals. Eventually I asked, if so her general, why ally with us? His large dark eyes met mine melancholically. Because I know Bolshevism, that terrible synthesis of madness and crime gripping my unhappy people. All because our fathers erred as you do. Your Eastern policy forces Russians a dreadful choice. Red or brown Bolshevism, Nagant or Mauser pistols. If torture, suffering, death inevitable, most Russians, hating Kremlin, choose Bolsheviks. They speak the language. Don't delude. We siding with Germany do so not from love, but knowing internal Russian freedom hopeless. We'll accept Russia you leave us, or fight you if not, after Red Plague's eradication. Even if you lose, we patriots persist. We fight not for Germany, but Russia. That dialogue stirred me deeply, though I concealed it. Afternoon, the Hauptsturmführer entrusted me an ambulance for my division, with 2 non-German speaking drivers. I departed for Lemberg, arriving midnight. Shells from medium Russian artillery cratered streets. Small Martin bomber groups droned high. Not a soul visible, neither civilians nor Germans. We crept through the dead city's streets via blacked-out headlights. Finally, 2 unguarded German vehicles before a grand building. I halted the ambulance, entered the gate. Upstairs, raucous carousing and singing emanated from a second-floor apartment. Inside, rowdy welcome, a known Untersturmführer, a Hauptmann, 3 Ukrainians reveling. Like me, they'd sought the division, wearied, settled in a deserted German officer's apartment. My drivers and I joined at the laden table. An hour later, I queried the drunken Untersturmführer on the situation. He knew not, arriving similarly hours prior. Uneasy nod. I stepped into the corridor. Behind, a door closed softly. Above, faint footsteps. Outside, stillness, distant buildings afire, sky aglow. A Stalin organ, salvo, crashed blocks away. Nearby, heavy machine gun bursts. I urged the Untersturmführer to contact our forces. He demurred. Too late. I abandoned the inebriates. In the dark corridor, another creak. I halted, pistol drawn. Where are you going? A faint woman's voice, hard Ukrainian accented German. There's death waiting outside. None of us can escape it, but tonight we're still alive. A hot, feverish hand slipped under my arm. Come in with me, German. After hesitation, I followed into her pitch-black apartment. I struck a match. She extinguished it. Why do you want to see? She murmured, guiding my hands to her firm breasts. I'm young, and yet I've got to die. Why not flee? I whispered. My mother is very ill. She'd die if I left. So we'll die together. It's better. For God's sake, why keep talking of dying? I said irritably, shaking off gloom. She laughed softly. I'm Ukrainian, and there are countrymen coming? I've loved a German. They shot off both his legs. He was taken to Germany, with wife and children. I'll never see him. I've loved a German. The NKVD shoots women for less. Come, stay. It's my last night. You needn't be afraid.